This was me in my congressional fellowship year, working for so you can see what the future looks like. I've made it a habit, sort of like Barbara did, of trying to get time with every congressional leader. I very seldom write anything about my time with them, but in the case of Mitch McConnell a couple of years ago, managed to spend about 6 hours with him because he was in the middle of writing a history of Kentuckians in the Senate, and was very interested in the history of the Senate, and actually had absorbed some myths about that really building. What I'd like to do today is spend just a couple of minutes giving a broad perspective on the conditions that are influenced by today's Congress. This is kind of a model of American politics, basically. If you happen to teach American politics, I oftentimes start with something like this, but it also ends up being a way to put in perspective today's intense partisanship. What are the sources of that partisanship? What are the causes and consequences of that partisanship? And I think we have to take that into account in order to understand multiple efforts, including fabulous efforts, to actually do something meaningful about partisanship that we're experiencing in this era. For my money, there are three fundamentals in understanding. Three fundamentals. One is simply the size of parties. This is something that Sarah spent a lot of time writing about, how the sizes of the parties affects institutional choices. Strength of parties shapes almost everything else that's done within Congress. Second thing, of course, is the distribution of policy commitments that are brought into Congress or acquired by Congress in every 2 years. What we sometimes refer to that as how polarized are the two parties. But the distribution of preferences about policy choices is a richer topic than mere polarization of parties, though the polarization of the parties has got to be central to our understanding of that. Now, those two things largely come from the electorate and party system. And that blue line is what we're usually theorizing about. There are thousands and thousands of pages of political science that focus on those two factors as drivers of a variety of kinds of developments in Congress. So, for example, I've got a book in progress that's almost done that makes the argument that the competitiveness of the Senate, how close the majority of the party size, drives organizational innovation in parties. So we see spurts of organizational development. The two parties are extremely competitive. And this is a process that dates all the way back to the 1820s. So those two factors are kind of fundamentals. They condition virtually everything that we see in Congress. But there's a third factor, oftentimes ignored but implied, that is time. Now, time, of course, has the effect of changing, allowing for change in these other factors that shape party size and partisan polarization. But there's more than that. Duration is an important factor. So the length of time in which the parties are in control of the House and the Senate, the length of time over which the two parties are extremely polarized, greatly affects the ability, willingness, and interest of members to change how they do their business to accommodate what they perceive to be kind of a new equilibrium in American politics that warrants a kind of an institutional response, an institutional change, a lasting change in behavior that becomes regularized, oftentimes even rooted in new chamber or party rules. And so those are the big factors. Now, for the most part, political scientists naturally think about constituency or electoral connection to how institutions behave. But we know that there's an awful lot of, there are many other things going on in our politics. But we might think of them as intervening variables. That is, organized interests and activists on the one hand, and the changing nature of the media on the other, contributing, reinforcing, enhancing the polarization effects of developments in the electorate. But notice too that there are arrows running in the other direction. That is, from legislators and from the institutions out to these other sources. We know, for example, that the House of Representatives experienced a surge in partisan polarization in the late 80s, well before we saw evidence for that in the general public. So it looks like the public was following on the heels of political elites, taking cues from those elites that helped then polarize the electorate, which of course then necessarily had a feedback effect on who was. So here's a couple of pictures that we're going to start with. The picture on the left is just for the Senate. The House pattern is very similar. Let's focus on the Senate. These are the size of the two major parties, Democratic and Republican parties, since the Civil War. And you can see that there have been four periods in which, at least over a few Congresses, parties have been of nearly equal size, and there's been changes in party control on more than one occasion. The argument there is that when that happens, parties are especially motivated to change their ways and try to find new techniques that will get them into majority status or to maintain majority status. What's especially important about this is how unique the most recent 40-year period is. It's by far the longest period of this kind of exceptional inter-party competition for control of the House. And because duration matters, it's given the two parties opportunities to adjust their strategies and look very different. We're actually in a very different regime of congressional decision making as a result of the changes that actually on Capitol Hill are now taken for granted. I'm going to skip over that other one for the moment. This is the second issue, that is the degree of partisan polarization. Everyone's seen the diagrams before. The blue line is the Democratic Party median, and the red is the Democratic or Republican Party median, way back into the 1800s. And you can see that in the most recent period here from roughly 1970 on, we see increasing polarization, with the Republicans becoming especially more conservative, Democrats becoming somewhat more liberal, and this is the exact data that usually leads to the observation that the Republicans have become more conservative than the Democrats. That's kind of a shaky conclusion if you're basing it on roll call votes like this, but this is the precise data that it's based on. Those same data produce these distributions, just to give you a better sense of how the parties change in the 1950s and 60s. That top left diagram is very typical of the distribution. What's important to see there, of course, the Democrats are always to the left of the Republicans, but what's important in that era is how much overlap there was in parties. There were plenty of conservative Democrats, South, plenty of liberal Republicans, disproportionately Northeast and Midwest, creating a large body of senators in this case, the same pattern obtains for the House, who are willing to coalesce with members of the other party, at least from time to time, on one issue after another. It also means that in that era, there was a very powerful conservative coalition. That is, the Democratic conservatives, right side, oftentimes joined with the Republicans to undo the best plans of the liberal Democrats. And then what's obvious over time as we go through decade by decade, and we finally get to the last complete Congress, we see the split of the two parties, no overlap whatsoever, but nearly complete polarization. So in the Senate, even the most conservative Democrats, mention Sinema, are actually to the left in their voting behavior of most liberal Republicans. Basically no overlap between the parties on the whole. Now, let me just skip that in the interest of time. So what does this mean for how Congress goes about its business? Years and years, 1986, I invented a little diagram, and I've revisited it recently in some of my writing, and I think it still makes sense. Though there's one element of it that is really surprising. One way to think about how Congress goes about its policy is to think about the number of units, committees, party venues that are actively involved in most decisions. So as decisions tend to be moved from the committee rooms up to, say, the Speaker's office in the extreme, it's a move from many units to just one in the extreme. And that's what we're talking about here, just a central tendency. So the number of effective decision-making. And down here is the number of effective participants. So how many legislators are actively engaged in making those policy decisions? Well, in the extreme, the House and the Senate look very different. The Senate especially has always appeared to be more collegial than the House. That is, more decisions are actually made on the Senate floor, one unit, the whole Senate, where all senators are participating, than was traditionally the case on the House floor, which tended to endorse the committee recommendations. So, for example, in the 60s and early 70s, the number of Senate amendments considered was generally 50–60% more than the number of House floor amendments. There were just a lot more floor decision-making in the Senate than the House. In the House, there was stronger tradition of deference to committees. In the Senate, where, of course, all senators have far more opportunities to offer amendments, and speak at length, and offer non-germane amendments to force issues onto the Senate floor. And the result of that was that the Senate always looked a little more collegial. That is, you might have to deal with somebody outside of the committee of jurisdiction in order to get an issue settled. And so the Senate always looked a little bit more collegial, and the House in the mid-20th century, of course, was very decentralized, very committee-oriented, with fairly strong norms covered by Princeton, by journalists and others that supported a committee-oriented decision making. But what's happened now that we've intensified the inter-party competition control of Congress, that's been our semi-permanent condition, and that the parties have become so polarized. Well, it's now just routine in political science to say, well, that creates greater centralization of policymaking. And there's no doubt that that's true. In the House of Representatives, even these speaker episodes here of the last couple of months demonstrate the point that the speaker is the center of policymaking in the House of Representatives. Very few of the speaker's real powers were challenged by those who were challenging McCarthy or the other candidates. It was always a question of how those powers should be used, not about whether or not they should exist. And that reflected a remarkable change in expectations about where policymaking should reside. And so we talk about the House as running on a continuum from decentralized to centralized, having become a lot more centralized in the period since Tip O'Neill was Speaker. In fact, Tip O'Neill is very much transitional. So was Jim Wright, but things came all the way around to a more centralized process by the mid-90s, of course, when the 90s, when Republicans took over. Now, in the Senate, I was among those who resisted the argument that policymaking would be centralized in the Senate. I thought it would there's something about the Senate floor that would serve as a buffer against House-like centralization and not party leader for the majority party. I was wrong. Things have become a lot more central. My initial thought that the ability of senators to force issues and force votes, the ability of the minority to check the majority through obstruction or threatened obstruction would limit the degree to which the majority party's leader would assume responsibility for setting the agenda and building all the major coalitions and directing activity. I was wrong about it. A couple of things surprised me. One is that the obstructionism on the part of the minority went far farther than I ever thought I'd ever seen. The transition to Mitch McConnell as Republican leader in 2007 represented a pretty dramatic change in attitudes on the part of the minority in the Senate about the viability of kind of all-purpose obstructionism. It was Mitch McConnell who coined the phrase the 60-vote Senate. By that he meant that anything of any importance had to have 60 votes or it would not get through the Senate. That was not, he insisted that that was Senate tradition. It was hardly the Senate. Just read the book with Sarah. And you'll see that that's changed a lot. Of course, the majority didn't just stand still for it. They responded, filling the amendment tree, inventing new provisions for unanimous consent. Just a couple of weeks ago, when they agreed to the UC request for the minibus appropriations, it had, if you go back and look at it, the last couple of lines in there about all these amendments requiring 60 votes in advance, requiring 60 votes. Even before a filibuster had materialized on any of those amendments. Well, that had changed things a lot. It's radically changed the conditions under which the Senate considers legislation on the floor, and we'll see some evidence for that. The thing there is that it's the majority leader, party leader, who orchestrate this. It's true, other senators like Patty Murray, very much involved in negotiating that agreement, but it is the majority leader who formulates it in the end, offers it. This arm through. So the Senate has actually moved a long way from a very collegial body in which floor decision-making activity is quite open, free, to one that's highly controlled by the majority leader. Let's look for some evidence about what this has meant for congressional committees. Well, just to give you a general perspective, this is the number of standing committees. On the bottom are the House committees in green and the Senate standing committees in blue. They really haven't changed much. When the Republicans came in 1995, they cut 3 standing committees, but other than that, had pretty much the same standing committees. But you can see that subcommittees in both houses expanded greatly over the course of the 50s and 60s, well into the 70s. Big surge, of course, in the 1970s after the so-called Subcommittee Bill of Rights was adopted by the Democratic caucus. The Democrats still in the majority, trimmed back on the number of subcommittees over the 80s. They realized that things had gotten a little out of hand, and they started imposing limits like a maximum of 8 subcommittees, I think was the first limit back in the 80s, and trimmed that a little bit. But when the Republicans came in after the 94 elections, they imposed radical cuts in the number of subcommittees, along with radical cuts in committee budgets. Over on the right is the number of staff. So the green lines are the number of personal staff in the House and the Senate. The blue line in the middle, in both cases, is the committee staff. You can see in the case of the House, the Republicans imposed a huge cut in committee staff from a little bit over 2,000 down to 1,200. So a very radical cut in committee staff, radically reducing the organizational capacity of House committees. A far more modest change was adopted in the Senate, and it's grown back a little bit since then. But the House remains much lower. Is there a substitute from the support agencies of Congress? Well, hardly. The Office of Technology Assessment, of course, was abolished by the Republicans in 1995. The CBO has been pretty much steady state from its origins in the Budget Act of 1974. And then CRS, of course, was greatly expanded with the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970 and held very high numbers during the 1970s and has been trimmed back with a big cut under the Republicans. And so CRS simply can't make up for the losses of staff that were experienced by the committees themselves. So what does this mean for committee activity? Well, the number of hearings and meetings are combined over here on the left, and the pattern is fairly obvious that in the 1970s we had a peak in committee activity, and it's fallen to remarkably low levels. The levels below what we were seeing in the 1950s. It's low. They're not doing much. They don't have much staff with which to do it, but they simply don't do much. Now, there's a little difference between Democratic majorities and Republican majorities, but the difference is minuscule because both parties have been stuck with minimal staffs. And of course, there are far fewer subcommittees in these. With many subcommittees, you could hold many hearings. Of course, they weren't always well attended. But today, such a small number of committees, very poorly staffed, unable to do much at all without the approval of a full committee chair, and they don't do much as a result. So what they would do, because they can't do much unless they're told in advance that they're allowed to do. Appointed and reporting legislation that the Speaker's office informs them is not going to go anywhere anyway. On the right are oversight hearings, just limited to oversight. And the green number is the total number of oversight hearings, and the blue line is a count that Kreiner and Schiller came up with a number of investigative hearings that were on special investigation. The story is essentially the same. The amount of oversight being shriveled to an extremely low number in recent Congresses. So the space for committee decision making isn't anything like what it was a generation. It's now minuscule compared to what it was a generation ago. The motivation for members to take their committee work seriously is so much more limited than it was once, in part because they don't have the resources to their interests. The other part of it is that they're oftentimes constrained by party interests about the issues that they were pursuing. What's happened to parties? Well, here's the count of party staff. These are staff members who are assigned to any of the party leaders' party committees. And you can see in both houses, there has been a remarkable change in the size of these committees, size of these party staffs. Some of this came in fell swoops. When Mitch McConnell became leader in 2007, he decided that he needed a war room like the Harry Reid Schumer war room of 2005, 2006, and he decided to hire overnight 20 staff members to create a communication staff under the direct supervision of the minority leader. Just an overnight radical change. Compare that with what Mike Mansfield had, say, for example, in about 1969-70. Mike Mansfield's leadership office had 3 staff members. 3, a receptionist, secretary, and 1 professional staff member. 3, that's all he had. Now, it's true that he had the party secretary who wasn't counted as part of the leadership staff. So he had a floor staff. There were 2 or 3 others operating under party secretary. So I had a little additional assistance there. But you could walk into Mike Mansfield's office and they could all be sitting there in the front desk. That was their staff. You ought to see their offices today. It's not quite like that. Their balconies are great too, but they're just.
I can't talk. I can't. Whatever. I don't care.
Party leaders. The space in the policy world that leaders can now fill because they have such large staff support is just incredibly different than it was 50 years ago. Just fundamentally different. So the committee space has collapsed and the party space has ballooned over recent decades. So what does this mean for congressional policy making? Well, when committees do get things to the floor, much of the legislation getting to the floor has been negotiated with the supervision of party leaders. It gets there under closed rules. So this is the nature of special rules, generally coded into 3 kinds: closed rules that allow no amendments whatsoever, open rules that allow all amendments that are in order under the rules, and structured rules, which permit some but not all amendments. And you can see that open rules have virtually disappeared in the House. It's just not possible for the minority to freely offer germane amendments to legislation the way they once did. In fact, those opportunities are extremely rare, made even the more rare, thanks to the Democrats in 2017, doing away with the motion to reconsider instructions, which always gave, with instructions, one last opportunity for the minority to offer amendment. And as you can see, now the majority of rules are not structured, they're majority. And if you think this is just my count, this is Don Wolfensberger's count, former chief of staff for the Republicans on the Rules Committee. What about the Senate? Well, everyone has seen the increase in the number of cloture votes. So this is the number of nominations and measures that were subject to at least one cloture vote. You've probably seen the number of cloture votes. I counted it a little differently so that we get a sense of how much legislation is subject to a cloture vote. Over on the red line is nominations. And of course, the Senate is voting on cloture on some nomination once or twice a day, thanks to minority insistence on doing so. But the blue line is legislation. And I've got that listed over here for the period since 1960. There were very, very few filibusters before 1960. So this is a reasonably good starting point. You can see that the number of legislative measures subject to at least one cloture vote has sometimes been over 50 for your Congress. Keep that in mind. what 50 cloture votes, or measures subject to a cloture vote means. The Senate's probably in session 30 weeks out of the year, 60 weeks over a 2-year period. Roughly once a week, they're faced with a cloture vote to pursue a piece of legislation. Increasingly, there are motions to proceed, so you don't even get to debate the bill unless you're able to vote cloture. And of course, this understates the effect of obstructionism manyfold. Why? Because leaders don't even bother, majority leaders don't bring up legislation that they obstructed so often that there's just a truckload of legislation that just sits idle. So what does this mean for other forms of floor activity? This is the number of floor amendments that have been subject to a roll call vote in the House and the Senate. And you can see in the House, the dashed line, that it's been up and down, no huge systematic change. That's in part because of where this count starts in 1970. In the early 1970s, they adopted electronic voting in the House, and that increased the number of amendments that offered and received votes. And so that number came from down here to up here. And then it fell back in late 1979. That's when a number of subcommittee chairs in the House appealed to Speaker O'Neill to start putting more restrictions on special rules on amendments. In fact, there was a letter, it's in one of my books back then, that was orchestrated by Dick Bowling, liberal Democrat from Kansas City, and at that time, second ranking Democrat on rules, to manipulate Tip O'Neill into asking him for more restrictive rules on behalf of liberal causes. They were getting tired of conservative amendments. So that had the effect of cutting down the amendments. When Republicans have come in the majority, they've generally said, well, we're tired of this, we're going to allow more amendments. But they usually do it for just 1 or 2 big bills, end up having 200 amendments, so the number shoots upward, but nothing else really operates that way. They operate like this. But the Senate, look what's happened to this floor-oriented collegial Senate that we knew in the mid-20th century. This pattern here is typical of the Senate in the 20th century. Oftentimes 50% more Senate amendments vote than House amendments. The Senate was simply a more floor-oriented process. But in this era of intensified obstructionism and the reaction of the majority to that obstructionism in the form of the amendment tree, not allowing a bill to come forward until the use that limits amendments has been approved by the Senate, all of which has the effect of radically reducing the number of floor amendments. This isn't a modest change. This isn't a modest change. We're getting down to just a few dozen amendments in a 2-year Congress here in recent past. This is a dramatic change in the character of the Senate, where senators were quite accustomed to being able to offer an amendment on almost any bill and maybe getting it absorbed into the bill by unanimous consent. Maybe the sponsors of the bill will just accept the amendment, peel it away in conference. But they don't do that much anymore. Why? Because they don't go to conference. This is the number of conference committees. We've actually had a recent Congress in which there were 0 conferences. How many of you in How a Bill Becomes a Law instruction learned that when the House and the Senate passed a major piece of legislation, it almost always had to go to conference to work out House-Senate differences? The conference would be comprised primarily of the senior committee members of the 2 houses, both parties. They'd negotiate an agreement between the 2 houses, so kind of a decentralized, let the committee run it. Then the House and the Senate would approve the outcome. It virtually never happens. all those post-passage negotiations now are conducted under the supervision of the top party leaders, oftentimes usually outside the context of a conference committee. Then the bill is brought back as an amendment to another bill that happens to be sitting in the House or the Senate, or a fresh bill with the negotiated text is reintroduced and passed in both houses more or less simultaneously. But you can see what this does. It radically changes who's involved in the legislature. Average member, especially someone of less than, say, median level seniority, simply does not have the opportunity to participate in the process. The committees don't have much staff. We have fewer subcommittees on which they can sit and take leadership positions. They have less staff to pursue their personal agendas on committees and subcommittees than they once did. They get blocked from offering amendments on the House and Senate floor. And when the differences between the two houses are substantial on a piece of legislation, they have no voice in how the House and the Senate negotiate the differences. So there are some, even in my profession, who still say committees are extremely important and they still do the heavy work. And there's still lots of bipartisanship. Well, you know, this is baloney. The world has changed in a very, very basic way. It is true that in order to get something passed, especially in the Senate, you may still need a bipartisan majority. That's true. That might be the only way you can get 60 votes, after all. But the fact that bipartisan majorities win only is a byproduct of the fact that 60 votes are required because the minority is obstructing and blocking so much that never gets counted one way or the other, never gets debated in committee, never gets subject to amendment. Issues simply die, members lose their opportunity to participate. Sarah's here, so I'm glad I this in here. That's Sarah Bender, by the way. The Sarah Bender, I should add, who, among other things, invented a dandy measure of the frequency of legislative gridlock. That is, she's taken those issues that are mentioned in New York Times editorials to find what the kind of national policy agenda is like in every Congress, and then asks for every 2-year Congress how frequently Congress actually votes on or enacts legislation with respect to those, and how often it does not. So how often it does not is kind of a sense of gridlock. And you can see that if we go back into the 1950s, that we're talking around, you know, a gridlock level of less than 40%. And in recent Congresses, getting up over 70% of the legislation subject to gridlock. The gridlock is important, but it also fundamentally alters the incentives for members of Congress to try to legislate. If they don't think they can go anywhere with this, because the Senate's going to kill it, or the leadership isn't going to allow it to come up in the House, the incentive to become involved in problem solving, in addressing the issues of the country, is radically reduced. That is a long-term condition in the Senate. By the way, here's a kind of a footnote. What's happened to presidential vetoes? Darn things have virtually disappeared. Well, of course, the president doesn't have to veto if everything is gridlocked in Congress. And so we see peaks of vetoes when the president is in the opposite party of congressional majorities. As you can see the long-term trend, the president just simply isn't engaged in the normal kinds of veto negotiations that presidents once were on a very regular basis. This doesn't happen much today at all. Presidents saved from having to veto by an obstructionist Senate coalition or by party leadership in the House that simply can dictate what comes to a vote. I think it's best for me to pause there. If there's at least a few questions. Sure. Questions? Okay, should I pick on someone? Go ahead.
Is like, so looking at this data, is there any sense, or like has anyone compared it to like volume or level of activity from administrative agencies, and like a sense that it's simply become easier for legislative bodies not to act at all, like for more like of necessary government functions to be carried out by administrative agencies?
Well, the answer is sure they have. Very frequently observed that these administrative actions, including executive orders coming out of the White House, has been a response to difficulty of getting. It's also a question of exploiting the fact that Congress has difficulty acting. The president decides unilaterally, stretching his power really what it ought to be. But if he knows that Congress can't react quickly, he can go ahead anyway. Now there's the courts, but that's an extremely slow process, and he can have a new policy in place for a year or two easily before courts end up acting on those unilateral actions by the White House. So yeah, it's a big part of the picture. And of course, if you're a friend of the president sitting in Congress, and you know that this is the state of affairs in Congress, you're going to encourage the president unilaterally. And there are many members who spend a lot of time.
So over time, you know, the incentive might want to even run for Congress is interested in policy. A lot. I mean, why would you? Very frustrated. Are very frustrated. Different because not going there to get anything done.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the answer. Don't know of any systematic evidence that would answer the question for us. It's been a while since someone has attempted a study to identify proto-candidates, people who are frequently mentioned as possible candidates for Congress, and gone out and interviewed them to figure out why it is that some of them run and some of them do not. It would be great for someone to it's not easy.
But over time, you have fewer and fewer people want to make policy.
But we do know that surviving a primary is more of an issue. And you know that's because of the nature of the activists and the donors involved in the primary process. And so there's been, we know something about the tendency for some districts to produce candidates because of the nature of the primary election. There is some system. But the question you ask about someone sort of generally interested in policymaking, staying away from it because they don't actually perceive that there's much opportunity in Congress, that especially for a junior member. It almost certainly has to be true, but it's a big country, and who knows if it really has radically changed of incentives for. Yeah. Yeah, part of this is ideological. There is no doubt that most conservatives running for Congress are probably not in the game of going to Congress for the purpose of discovering new solutions to problems. They already know the answers. And so it's really a question, and for the most part, it means cutting programs, cutting the size of the federal government, reducing the role of government in life. And for that purpose, you're just going to be a foot soldier by in that cause by Congress. And I think there probably is an increase in the number of those types there. Liberals used to be able to look at the Moynihans or the Kennedys or the many others who were creative legislators, who worked closely with policy experts. They themselves became so expert that they invented approaches to addressing a variety of problems. There's not much room for that. No, I think the country suffers for that.
I'm not a political scientist, so this might not be a very sophisticated question, but do you see any path to getting past the gridlock?
Well, this is where I probably end with that original diagram and say that we have a variety of, and one way to characterize those in this classification. This is just a limited look at it, but what David, for example, very much trying to shape the attitudes and skills of the people on Capitol Hill so as to mitigate the partisanship that might otherwise actually occur. And so people reform is what's given an awful lot of emphasis. Over the last couple of Congresses, the House has had a committee on the modernization of Congress. And of course, they did try to address the partisanship issue. But they didn't come up with much, I must confess. What they focused on was trying to create venues in which Democrats and Republicans could get to know each other better. They have more experience in dealing with each other and a greater appreciation for the circumstances of each other. And so increasing the number of venues, increasing the number of CODELs, congressional delegations, those are proven to have softened relationships among fairly long CODELs with the party. The Modernization Committee suggested creating a space, sort of like the House Republican and Democratic cloakrooms, but a space right there where members of the two parties can meet casually in their minutes off. But they don't have to sit or snooze separately, they can nap together. And so that's a suggestion. Maybe the speaker's lobby should be turned over to bipartisan meeting place. So those are the kinds of things that have been proposed. Changes in orientation sessions at the start of a Congress, changes instructional or educational activities that bipartisan based. Those are the kinds of things here, and the effort that David heads is even more focused on negotiation skills, on the theory that you can reduce some of the partisanship by actually giving people skills to deal with each other. And they oftentimes, professional staff come in precious little experience, but you can train them and encourage them and expand their skill sets so that it's possible to overcome partisan differences. But you can see my perspective, and that is that most of the incentives for the intense partisanship we're seeing doesn't come from within members of Congress, staff who are sitting there right now, largely due to this larger political the nature of the primaries, the nature of the electorate itself. Well, Congress might have polarized before the electorate did. The electorate now is shaping who succeeds in primaries and elections in a powerful way. And of course, that electorate's being shaped by activists and donors. And this year, we're probably going to have $2.5 billion of independent congressional elections. Just huge sums of money. most of it from relatively extreme sources. And the media, of course, we all complain about, has become siloed by ideology and partisanship. I think those incentives are so powerful that we really have to wait, be patient, and see if new issues generate new coalitions and bring a different kind of member, therefore a kind of staffer on Capitol Hill. But it's easy, I think, after experiencing really the last 40 years of intense partisanship, rising, and not changing, only getting worse, to lose patience with this, get fed up. And I share that disappointment. But there are many efforts like David's geared toward breaking the cycle. Hardly anybody says it's just this or just that we need to do. So we've got lots of election reformers, alter the way primaries are operating, change somehow campaign finance laws, alter the mix of money that's running campaigns, influencing candidates. So all of those things could play a role. Hardly any one of them, it seems to me, is a problem. So either we can chip away at it, and bless his heart, David is working on one key element of it, but there are many other things that we could do. For example, we have a bunch of political science friends in town who advocate radically increasing the size of the House. Well, what does that mean? Well, for one thing, it would connect members to smaller constituencies and maybe change the nature of the campaigns that they and the kinds of interests and so on that they represent. Make congressional members of Congress more local than they are right now. That's one argument. But the other part of the argument is that if you can greatly increase the size of the House, then you can begin thinking creatively about other changes in the electoral system, like maybe moving to proportional representation within a state for House seats. Now there's probably not enough House seats in the state. The average state has, what, 8 representatives or something. That's probably not enough to divvy up through a PR system. But it probably, the argument is still better than the current system. It's just that we still have a bunch of states with 1 or 2 members, and that doesn't really provide for much of a PR system. But if we can increase the size of the House, even to the size of the British House of Commons, 650, move it from 435 to 650, we could certainly create pretty genuine public proportional representation competition in states.
Would that be enough if you just went to 650 as opposed to, say, tripling the size of the House? Would that be enough to provide for multi-member districts and get some of the benefits that people attach to that as an idea?
Well, the multi-member districts that I was just describing would be statewide districts. So if you're from Arizona and you've got 10 districts and you move that to, say, 15 districts, well, now you created the possibility that a third party or a fourth party could pick up 1 or 2 representatives and have representation in Congress. And they may be in a position to be pivotal in building coalitions, winning coalitions in Congress. And that would alter the dynamics. The 2 major parties, without any worry about a third competitor or a fourth or a fifth, certainly encourages the kind of partisanship that we see. So their argument is that you change that party dynamic a great deal, and you might reduce some of the extremism that you see taking over.
If you combine that with
Ranked choice voting and many other possibilities. So those electoral changes, most of them though are contingent on the size of the House.
Got a late start, so we're.
Yeah, Megan.
So one of the themes here is this interplay between the politics and the institutions and how they sort of co-create each other over time. Thinking about the centralization in both the House and the Senate, it occurs to me that a lot of that has happened in the context of at least three very capable leaders within institutions that have increasingly supported those particular leaders. Are we perhaps in a situation where we're going to end up with institutions that are geared around really centralized parties without leaders that can support that, which may in some ways be something that we're seeing in the House right now? Is that a possibility that you see, and what might the concerns or implications of that be?
Well, I'm generally not in favor of an argument, or I don't find persuasive an argument that we just need better leaders or a different character of leaders. I think we get the leaders that, for the most part. Mitch McConnell has really evolved a lot over time. I see him as a leader whose primary skill is gauging the opinion of his conference and then getting out ahead of that parade as quickly as possible and then appearing to take a lead. It was no accident that when Scalia passed away, that McConnell, sitting on vacation in the South, could an hour after the news arrived announce that they would not be holding any hearings on any new nominee. He didn't have to talk to anybody, but he knew precisely what his party would insist on. That's the kind of leader. Yeah, and if you think about McConnell, maybe health scare leaving, and you think about the three Johns, one of them taking his place, it's hard to see any of them being any different in general attitude about party strategy. McConnell's, I'm in the minority, I obstruct, I think is a general strategy that any one of those would pursue justice actively. That's what members want. And of course, when that happens in the Senate gets all tied up in knots. And that, of course, that's but that's the kind of Senate we wanted. So, the fact that they're voting on all of these cloture motions for nominations, that's fine with him. It takes up time. You can't do anything else. And we're obstructing. Of course, we could get blamed for being so obstructionist, but who in the general public is going to care that we're obstructing one of these? It's an easy win for the minority, slowing down the legislative process. And Tuberville eventually gets the question. Ultimately. But generally, very tolerant of this, and they're all supportive. I don't see any big differences there. In the House, it's a little more difficult to figure, but we've seen what's happened in the speakership contest, and it's not easy to explain how Mike Johnson became Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. I can't easily explain it. No, I can't explain it at all. Even hard. It's really impossible. But he's only encouraging the radicalism and the posturing, taking advantage of the Israeli funding by throwing in the IRS money. This is the kind of thing which he's doing because he's expected. Could McCarthy have done better? Personally, could have done better. So I don't think it's the leaders. I think it's the kind of member.
Right.
The Congressional Fellowship experience was unimaginably important to me. I learned things and discovered things I couldn't even have thought about before I worked for the Speaker for a year. Some things just by sitting there and absorbing what was going on. It meant all the difference in the world to me, and made everything on Capitol Hill so much more real. That it allowed me to my own career in scholarship. Over the years, I had opportunities to work on Capitol Hill. He wanted me to stay on working for the steering policy committee, but I was kind of tired of being on Capitol Hill whenever he was there, and just kind of tired after a while. He was there for a late dinner and all the Leon Panetta later asked me to be a food stamp subcommittee staffer on agriculture. But that was 3 weeks after they had just passed the last ag bill, and there wasn't going to be any business for another 4 years. It didn't sound like a very big deal. And then the Iran-Contra investigation committee wanted a political science writer. I said, this be a 1,000-page report, and I said, I think I need some help. So I asked my friend Paul Light whether he wanted to do it. Paul and I went up and talked and had a meeting with everybody. He looked at me and said, this lawyer is going to be running, right? I said, okay, we're out. But it's always been tempting. And the Congressional Fellowship is such a great way because you get to leave. So you get to sit there and absorb it and have fun for the whole year. It just